able to get my tabs from.
All right, we're going to start. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate this. I want to introduce you to my assistant, Monica Mizrachi.
Hello.
Most of you know her, but some of you maybe knew my previous assistant, Hadass Linder, who went back to Israel. And that's why now Monica is my assistant. Anyway, my name is JJ Surbeck. I think I know a few of you, but you don't. Some of you don't know me, and vice versa. So I'll introduce myself very briefly. I usually go by JJ, but JJ stands for Jean-Jacques. It's a French name, and that's because I'm originally from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, Geneva. I came from there probably 30 years ago in this country. I'm an American citizen, of course, but I'm also still a Swiss. My background is international affairs and international law in particular. I had a long career with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the organization that created the Geneva Conventions, that brought the Geneva Conventions to the world. It's not necessarily Israel's best friend, as probably most of you know, but that's beside the point. When I was working for them, I was not really aware of the fact that they're biased against Israel. That's something that I discovered later. The reason I wasn't aware of it is because you need to know this. I need to tell you right away. Contrary to what a lot of people assume, I'm not Jewish. My wife is Jewish, but I was born and raised Catholic, and of course now I'm very involved in the Jewish community, but basically I don't have a Jewish background. I became very interested in Israel, however, a few years back, and that was basically what triggered my interest was the fact that I could see, as all of you know, that there was so much biased information on Israel, which I knew from an international law perspective and international affairs perspective was not accurate, was not correct. So I went around the community and I started knocking on doors and saying, well, guys, do you have a program to counter that? Do you train people? Do you have an education of some sort? And that was 10 years ago. And frankly, there was nothing. But the response I got was, don't worry about it, JJ. We have everything under control. And I went, okay, who am I to challenge anybody? I'm not Jewish. I don't know the Jewish community at the time, especially. So I accepted that. But I realized that their view of what Hasbara work it was and still is to a degree, and what I think is necessary, were very different. So one day I woke up and I decided, well, I can't find any real good program, real good description of the conflict. I'm going to put together all the information I have and put it together. And that's how I ended up preparing this lecture that you're going to hear tonight. And after that, a whole series of lectures. There is a list on the table that you can pick up. The next one is going to be on October 11th here. And it's going to be the difficult questions, the questions that everybody argues about. The occupied territories, the apartheid, the refugees, these themes that keep coming over and over again anytime there is a discussion about the Middle East conflict. So what I want to do tonight is give you something that is really a challenge, and that's an overview in 1 hour of the entire Middle East conflict. And when I start telling that to people, they look at me like, are you local? What do you realize what you're talking about? It's a very complex story. It's impossible. You can't tell the whole story in just 1 hour. And I said, well, I'll try. And I did. And I started giving this lecture actually 5 years ago, here in this very same place, and giving over and over and over again. And a lot of people, I think it was something like over the years, something like 2,000 people or maybe more have seen this one and some of the others as well. So without further ado, that's what I'm going to, that's just the introduction, and I'm going to go ahead and plunge into the subject matter. So it's a complicated story. And I think what is really important for us to understand is, I don't know why this thing appears. Excuse me 1 second here. Well, maybe it'll go away. This is the problem that we're facing. Before you think what you want to think, be sure to know what you need to know. What does that mean? Well, usually when you have an argument with people about the Middle East conflict, people already know everything there is to know. Their mind is made, and is made up, and you can't go through. You can't get through to them. He said, no, there are other factors, and that's on both sides of the fence. So I think it's really important, and that is the mission of our group team. I didn't mention that, but as I gave these lectures over and over again, it became clear to me that there was a need for, it became very demanding, so I dropped my previous job, and I created a 501c3, which is TEAM, Training and Education about the Middle East, in order to be able to do this full-time. So the mission of TEAM is precisely to give all the facts of the conflict in order to allow people to know the facts, and then they can judge, and they can draw their conclusions. I've drawn my own conclusions, and I will share them with you, and maybe you will agree, maybe you won't, but that's the bottom line. You need to know what you're talking about, rather than, you hear a lot of people talk, make statements, especially use slogans. They don't even know what they're talking about. They just like the sound of the slogans, and that's why we need to learn how to recognize and counter. So, I think I'm going to pretend that you're a general audience from the general population here in San Diego who doesn't know much about the Middle East conflict. And you guys, of course, I know all of you have a connection with Israel to a degree or another, so some of this information you already know. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to convey tonight is how to present all this information in one package to an audience that doesn't know anything about the Middle East conflict. So, one thing that I start by doing is I ask people, let's look at the whole situation in toto, from a global perspective. And there are three angles that we need to look at first and foremost: the geographical angle, the numerical angle, and the historical angle. So let's start with the geographical angle. The first thing that I ask people is, how large is Israel, do you think? People who don't know anything, they will tell me, I've heard it. Oh, it's like Italy or England.
The size of New Jersey.
Well, the truth is that it is the size of New Jersey, exactly. Then I show them this map, and then you can see that this is not the size of Italy. This is the size of New Jersey, if that. So people are shocked to discover that. Or another way to put it is this. So you look at these distances. The time it takes from San Diego to Los Angeles, it would take you from Eilat to basically Beersheba, or Ashkelon maybe, and then another 2 hours, and you're at the very top of the country. And this is the longitudinal way. If you want to go here, this is the closest point between the West Bank and the coast. We all know it's 9 miles. I mean, how long does it take to cover 9 miles? So the size of Israel is ridiculously small. And I think that's really the first thing that people need to really understand. How can a country so small keep getting so much attention? I mean, when you talk about Israel every day in the paper, there's an article. Why? Why is it? How is it possible? So we'll talk about the reasons later, but that's the first perspective. Here's another way to look at it geographically. I show this map to people who don't know where Israel is, and believe it or not, there are people who don't know where it is. They don't even know where to put the United States on the map. There are some people, its situation's pretty bad in some quarters. But anyway, so they look at this map, and it takes them at least 30 seconds to figure out where it is, because they don't know. So I have to point it out. It's right here, this tiny little thing. Now, this is a number that you want to remember. The size of Israel is less than 1% of the land mass of all the Arab countries surrounding Israel. It's ridiculous. It is so small. So that's the geographical angle. Let's talk about a few numbers now. Let me try to get rid of this thing. It's a little annoying. I don't know why it's there. Okay, there we go. Let's talk about, give a sense of perspective with numbers. How many countries do we have in the world today?
190.
100?
90?
And 90?
157.
157? Any better number? You win. 198.
Because they keep making new countries every time you look around.
That's true, almost.
Sudan was the latest one, right?
And the last one was Southern Sudan.
Southern
Exactly. Sudan was split into two last year, and that's the newest country in the world. How many of those are members of the United Nations?
170.
$197.
Very close, very close. 193. So that means practically everybody, right? I think the only ones that are not are some Pacific island in the ocean. I don't even know where they are. Now let's talk about, from another perspective, the religious perspective. How many of these 198 countries are Christian countries? And that, as you can imagine, means all of South America, a lot of Africa, Europe primarily. So altogether,
60.
50,
70.
30, any,
40.
40, any other?
90,
70.
70, you're getting close.
90, I see.
90, 100. More or less. It really depends on how you define a Christian country, but basically, let's say more or less 100. Okay, how many Muslim countries now? I didn't say Arab, I said Muslim,
All of those plus Indonesia and
25.
right?
91.
30.
God protect us. Actually, there are 56 Muslim countries today, including Indonesia and other countries that are not Arab exactly. So now let's put aside the Christian and the Muslim countries, and let's talk about the countries that are neither Christian nor Muslim. And that's countries like Japan, Korea, you name it. They have, primarily Asian countries.
Well, the difference, that's 156 and there's 198, so there's 42 left.
Yeah, you're pretty good. You're pretty close. About 30, more or less. 30 that are neither Christian nor Muslim, 30, 35. And now, of course, here comes the last question. You can, oh no, excuse me. First of all, there's another important question. How many Arab countries? I didn't say Muslim this time, I said Arab.
Turkey. Would Turkey be one? Was that considered an Arab country?
No, the Turks are different than the Arabs, and so is Iran. Iran is Persian. Pakistan is Pakistanis. These are not Arab countries.
So what's the
We're-
difference between a Muslim country and an Arab country?
Yeah.
That's precisely the point. Muslim countries are all the countries that follow Islam.
And Arab countries?
Arab countries are ethnically Arab countries, and it's primarily all the countries that surround Israel.
So Egypt was an Arab country and now it's a Muslim country.
No, it's actually all Arab countries are by definition Muslim.
Ah.
So what happens is that, okay, I'll give you the number, 21. 21, and you hear 22 sometimes because a lot of people put Palestine into it, even though it's not a country yet. So 21, all of these are Muslim by definition because they're Arab. So if you do the numbers 56 Muslim minus 21, you have the number of non-Arab Muslim countries. And as Jose was saying, Indonesia is the most populous, 170 million. Pakistan is the next one, 150 million people. These are all Muslim, but they're not Arabs. Iran, 80 million people. They're not Arabs, but they're Muslim, and so forth. Wherever Islam went, they turned the whole country into a Muslim country, with a few exceptions, with minorities in Lebanon and the Copt in Egypt.
So you're
That's
saying the
it.
definition of an Arab country is one that just borders Israel? Is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
yeah, it's primarily the countries that are around Israel.
So like Yemen or Bahrain, are those Arab countries?
They are Arab
But
countries
they don't
too.
border Israel.
No, they don't. You're right. All the Arab Peninsula countries are Arab countries, but you're right. They don't border. It extends a little bit farther. You're right. So, last question: how many Jewish countries do we have in the world? And you know the answer to that one, but this is where I try to convey to people who don't know anything about this. There's only one Jewish country in the world. So the conclusion that I want people to reach is that, well, you look at these numbers. Why can't they leave it alone? There's only one single tiny microscopic Jewish state. That's the first approach. That's the second approach, a geographical perspective. Now I'm going to give you, that's the numbers perspective. Now I'm going to give you the historical perspective. The one thing that we keep forgetting when you talk about the Middle East conflict or people read articles and so forth, they completely focus on either Israel or the disputed territories. That's all they focus on. They don't even know that there is tremendous history behind this, that this area has been conquered, disputed for millennia, not even hundreds, centuries, millennia. So this is a partial list of the number of people who conquered what is today the Holy Land and either disappeared or were defeated by someone else and so forth. So you had the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Persians, the Arabs, the Crusaders, the Ottoman Turks, and finally the British. And we have now today. Here it is. I'm going to show you a map which I think is absolutely amazing. It tells this whole story of 3,000 years, excuse me, in 2 minutes and 22 seconds. That's pretty good. Can't beat that. So watch carefully because it goes fast. Okay, it starts here. Look at the dates here. We have the Kingdom of Egypt. And keep your eyes on what is today Israel, because that's how it evolves very fast. The Egyptians were always at war with the Hittites in the north. Then we had the actual Kingdom of Israel, Solomon and David. That lasted about, a little bit over a century. Was destroyed by the Assyrians. The Assyrians destroyed the first temple. Then the Babylonians came, took the Jews in captivity. Then the Persians came, freed the Jews from Babylon. They went back to the Holy Land, but then they were taken over by the Macedonian Empire, by the Greeks, which in turn, of course, was succeeded by the Roman Empire, which in turn was several hundred years later was replaced by the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine were always at war with the Persians here. It was the Sassanid dynasty. And they weakened each other so much that when the Muslim came, they were easily defeated, and the Muslims conquered this entire region. There was another one that came later, the Seljuks, that came from Central Asia. Then we had the Crusaders that came to free Jerusalem, as we all know, in their own way. They were themselves defeated by Salahuddin, the Muslim leader who created his own empire and dynasty. And all of these were almost completely destroyed by the Mongols. When the Mongols came all the way, almost destroyed Islam, but they survived. And there were several generations until later the Ottomans conquered this entire area. The Ottomans were defeated in 1817 by the colonial powers, and then the colonial powers basically cut the pie between themselves and sort of drew all the borders that we have today. In 1948, the State of Israel was created. An offer was made to the Arabs, and I'll get back to that. There was a war, as we know, when the Arabs attacked. And I will get back to this map because it's a really important one to see when all these countries became independent. And that was it. That is the history of the entire Middle East in 2 minutes and 22 seconds. A lot happened.
Constant turmoil.
A lot of turmoil, exactly. Huge amount of history, fascinating history. But I mean, so I think it's really important when we talk about this area to really keep that in this perspective. Again, the geographical one, the historical one, and the numbers one, the number perspective. So, I think the first important thing that we need to convey after all this is that the Jews were in Palestine for millennia, and they have had a presence there all through these centuries, all through every occupation. There always were communities of Jews that stayed with the Holy Land. The connection was never completely severed. Maybe after 70, when the Second Temple was destroyed, the diaspora was created, but the connection to Israel was never completely abandoned. So this is an important point to keep in mind, because if you remember, that's something that you hear a lot on the part of the Palestinians. They say the Jews have no history with the Holy Land. Even it can go into the comical of the absurd when you have someone like Arafat telling to President Clinton that there never was a temple in Jerusalem, a Jewish temple. I mean, you know, when you hear something so absurd, you don't know what to do. Is it like, what? You know nothing about history, or rather you denied history, and you denied the Jews their own history, and that's unacceptable. So briefly, the David and Solomon kingdom from 1990 to 9028 BCE, that was, when you think of it, a short time. When you look at all the previous empires and so forth, but it was clearly it was the last time Israel had its own independent kingdom. That was replaced much later under the Romans by King Herod, 30 to 70 CE, the Common Era. And you notice that what was Israel at the time, I could look at the other map too, it was not the map you have today. It was much wider. And I'm not advocating the greater Israel history theory that some Israelis advocate. That's not my point at all. I just want to show that from a historical perspective, Israel was a lot bigger in those days than it is today. Even under Herod, it went well into Syria, as you can see, and a good chunk of Jordan as well. So let's go back to this map, because I think it's crucially important. Do you see any borders here?
Well, between the Ottoman Empire and surrounding areas.
An empire is an empire. You don't have borders inside, you have borders towards the outside. So all of these countries that make today what used to be the Ottoman Empire did not exist then as independent entities, as nations. And I think that's very important to remember, because it has a bearing on the narrative that you hear today on both sides. You have the Israeli side and you have the Palestinian side, and they come up with a completely different story. So keep this thing in mind for the time being. What did we have under the Ottomans? Under the Ottomans, you had what every empire since the beginning of time has, which is administrative provinces. They divide their empire into different provinces. So this particular area was divided between a number of what they call sanjak. Sanjak is like a state, or county, if you want. And so you have the sanjak of Acre here, what is Akko today, sanjak of Jerusalem, the sanjak of Kerak, which I think is in Jordan, Nablus. As you can see, there were a number of subdivisions, if you want, administrative division. That's what you had within the Ottoman Empire. So then the Europeans came along. They defeated the Turks at the end of World War I, and European colonialism is a pretty shameful period. I think everybody agrees with that, to the extent that basically the European powers got together in Berlin in, I believe, 1864. They took the map of the world and they basically sliced it. And they started drawing line, okay, this is for you, I'm going to take this, and so forth. They basically shared the world when they had no right to do that. But that's what colonial powers do. They just appropriate what other people's countries, even if these countries did not exist at the time. So that was the era of European colonialism. And the result was this. The result was all these countries that we have today were created by the colonial powers. In particular, I want to draw your attention to this. Look, Syria was created by the French in 1946, and so was Lebanon. Iraq was created in 1932 by the British. In 1948 we had Israel, but in 1946 we had Jordan. Saudi Arabia in 1932, here you have Kuwait in 1961, and so forth. What my point is, these countries were all created as a result of the colonial powers and, of course, decolonization when the colonial powers went home. So it's really important to understand this, because the accusation that you hear quite often, and I'll go into that in my second presentation a lot more in detail, is that, oh, Israel is a colonial power. And I'm asking, how can you say that? Israel is the result of colonialism. It cannot in itself have been a colonial power because it was itself the result of colonialism.
So where were the Palestinians?
The Palestinians were like all the Arabs in this region. They were just Arabs in that area. There was no Arab Palestinian state. There was no Palestinian entity. There was not even a Palestinian awareness. The Palestinian awareness came after the in the 60s, in early 60s, but not before. There never was a really distinct Palestinian culture. I'll give you an example to that is in opposition, in contrast to the Palestinians, the Kurds. The Kurds are in this part of the Middle East. They straddle actually 4 or 5 countries. There's 40 million of them. They have their own language. They have their own religion. They're Muslim, but it's a variant of the traditional Islam. These people deserve their own state because they had a distinct identity. They didn't get it because the colonial powers ignore them. Since then, they've been at war basically with each one of the states of which they are part. They're constantly at war with the Turks, as you probably read in the paper on a constant basis. They have now about a third of Iraq. They're sort of semi-autonomous. They had a chunk in Iran. There's a bit of them in Syria as well. So the Kurds are a really good case for a nation that should have been given its own nation, its own state, and didn't get it. The Palestinians are the reverse. The Palestinians did not exist, and yet they want us to believe that they deserve a state because they've always existed. That's not true. It never was the case. They did develop their own identity because of the fact that they lost the war against Israel. And so, yes, they do exist today, but historically speaking, that is not true. To say that there has always been Palestine, that's absurd. I mean, historically speaking, it doesn't hold. So, you see Egypt 22 and so forth. So I think it's really important to have a good sense of how Israel really is part of this whole development of creation of different nations by the colonial powers. Now, how did it happen? Well, in 1917, Lord Balfour in England issued a declaration saying, well, you know, we're now remodeling the world, basically. It's the end of World War I. The Ottomans have been defeated. The Germans have been defeated. It's our chance to reshape the world. So we're creating all these Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. These are all Arabs. Why don't we put aside a little chunk of land for the Jews? Because they have a historic link to that area as well, recognized in the Bible, and all Western culture, Christian base, recognizes that. So he came up with this proposal that was endorsed by the British government, and then it was also endorsed by the League of Nations. The League of Nations preceded the United Nations, of course, of today. And make a long story short, at the end of World War I, Great Britain, since they came up with this great idea, the League of Nations said, okay, you take care of it. We're giving you a mandate. You're going to run that area and prepare it until it can become an independent state of its own. Not talking about the Jews, not talking about the Arabs, except for the fact that this one was reserved for the Jews. That was agreed upon. So when I say not talking about the Jews and the Arabs, I mean by that they didn't discuss how they were going to get these two together. They just said that they were going to create a state separate for the Jews. Everybody thought that was great, but then what happened? In 1922, all of a sudden, the British, without telling anybody, without consulting with anybody, decide, oh no, we need another Arab state. because they had made promises to almost everybody. They had made like 6 or 7 separate promises to different local leaders, and they were caught with their own lies. So they had to find a way out of this, and they decided to take, oh well, hey, this whole piece of land that we have put aside for the Jew, why don't we just lop off 2/3 of it, and we're going to create a new state. So the history behind this is that, how many of you have seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia? If you haven't, rent it, watch it. It's very instructional. It really gives you a good idea of the history behind this. Short story, to make a long story short, the British needed the help of the Arabs to fight the Turks, because the Turks control the entire Mediterranean basin. So they wanted the Arabs to help them fight the Turks, and especially in that region. And here is Saudi Arabia. So the British and Lawrence of Arabia was just a spy. I mean, he's been glorified into this romantic figure, but he was just a spy, and an effective one. He got the Arabs to side with the British, fight the Turks, but which Arab did he deal with? That's the problem. There was not one unified family of Arabs in Saudi Arabia. You had several clans. You had the Hashemite dynasty in Medina and Mecca and Medina, the 2 holy places, and they claimed descendants from the Prophet, which gave them legitimacy to be the rulers of Saudi Arabia. But then you had also this Ibn Saud guy, who was the head of his own tribe and clan, and who wanted to become the big kahuna. And he decided, well, I'm going to take advantage of the situation, help the British, and then they're going to have to pay me back, and that's exactly what happened. At the end of World War I, Ibn Saud said, time for payback, I want to be the king. He was never king. The Saudis were never kings before. The king were the Hashemites. So the British were really in a bind. And they looked around and they said, well, we have to find a new country for these guys and get them out of there. And so for the 2 Hashemite kings, the 2 sons of the Hashemite king in former king of Saudi Arabia, they found a throne in Iraq and in Jordan. So this became the Jordanian kingdom. The other one was sent to Iraq, and he was thrown out just a few years later. There was a coup d'etat or something. It didn't last very long. But anyway, back to Israel. The bottom line is that the Jews lost all of this because of the politicking of the British with the Arabs, and especially the Saudis. So they were sacrificed for realpolitik, real politics, if there was ever a case. What was really annoying is this thing, is that not only was this kingdom completely taken off the map for the Jews, but they were completely barred. They were not allowed to move there. So the only place now where they were allowed to move was in this piece of land, whereas before they were allowed to go here. It didn't last very long, and there wasn't really enough time for many Jews to emigrate in what is today Jordan anyway. But it was very unfair. The way the British did it was, like they did so many things like this.
So what
in
if they
history.
were there before? They had to leave?
Excuse me?
If they were there before, they had to leave?
I don't think that there were very many before. There were a few, and they were kicked out after the 1948 war, but I'll get to that later, like all the Jews in the Middle East. So, now we get to 1937. In the meantime, the British are running the place, and the Arabs, from day one, do not want the Jews there. That's the bottom line. To this day, they just do not want to accept the fact that the Jews are entitled to be there and to share the land with them. They don't want that. So there were several massive riots and revolts in 1930 and 1936 in particular against the British by the Arabs, which were repressed. Were extremely bloody, thousands of casualties. That's something that, it's a little piece of history that not very many people know, but the British didn't know what to do. They realized that it was not going to happen. The Jews and the Arabs were not going to get together, So they came up with this plan, said, well, how about if we share the country with you guys? So the Jews we're gonna give you this. There will be an international zone between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and the Arabs, you can have everything else. And the Jews said, oi, that's not exactly what we had in mind, but it's better than nothing. So, okay, we'll take it. And the Arabs said what they have always said ever since, systematically, la, which means no. For those of you who speak Hebrew, lo is no in Hebrew. In Arabic is la. So we heard to this day, all we hear from the Arab is la, la, la. They absolutely do not want to make any concession. So, in a sense, what I find really ironic when you look at this whole history is that the Arabs, by being so stubborn and so hateful, have given Israel one present after another. Can you imagine? Let's imagine. They had said, okay, Iowa, yes, we'll take it. We take this. This is what Israel would be today. So they actually made, they gave a present to Israel by refusing to accept this compromise. But they made several presents later, and I will point them out. So, jumped 10 years later, 1947, the UN and the British are pulling their hair. They're trying to figure out a way to get these Arabs and these Jews to live together in peace. They can't find a way, so they go back to the table and they send a special commission, and the special commission come back and said, let's have a plan, and we are going to split the country between the two communities. And you look at this map, and if you don't know anything about it, the first thing that you think is, what have these people been smoking? It's insane. How do you create two countries that are intertwined like this with three parts like this? It's crazy. No country in the world has this type of situation. Well, there is one in between Azerbaijan and I forgot the other country. There's some very intricate, but that's the result of a war. This was supposed to be a peaceful plan. And again, the Jews said, it's not great. Look at this. That's not what we had in mind. We wanted more than this. But, okay, we'll take it.
But that's more than 10 years ago, right?
What's that?
That's more than 10 years ago.
That's in 47.
I know, the other plan in the other slide.
No, it wasn't. The other one was in 37.
Right, I'm saying in 47 the Jews are getting more land, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, if you look, you
Right.
compare.
yeah,
Clearly. That's what
So-
I'm saying. The Jews got a better deal with the Arabs saying no.
right.
The second time around, you have a better deal. But here's where the Arabs did another present. Instead of saying, okay, we'll take this, no, instead they complain, and they in particular complain to this day. I've had this argument with pro-Palestinians. To this day they said, oh, but the Jewish population was less than the Arabs, and they got more land. And I said, yes. Have you looked at what land the Jews got? The Negev,
The desert.
the desert. There's nothing in there. There was nothing in there. So it's not fair to say that they got more land. They actually got some good land up here and here, but the south is primarily desert, so you can't say that. But anyway, instead of saying, okay, we'll take that deal,
And Jerusalem was to be an independent enclave there.
Jerusalem, it was not going to be an entire area, it was just a separate entity around Jerusalem itself, correct, by some international body yet to be defined. It didn't happen. Why did not happen? Because the Arabs, instead of accepting this deal, attacked. They immediately attacked, and they tried to destroy Israel, as you all know. They attacked from the north, they attacked from the east, they attacked here from Jordan, and you had units also from Egypt. And the declared goal was to wipe out Israel. Has anything changed today? Well, no, it still is their obsession. So the problem for them is that they lost. And I want to really draw your attention to this map, because this is one of the main arguments I have with the pro-Palestinians around town here. One in particular, you were mentioning Barghouti. who gave a lecture recently.
Marwan?
Oh yeah, he does that well. And he always comes up with this line that cracks me up, and it makes me laugh, but I think it's kind of sad too. He says, yeah, the United Nations came up with this plan, and then, oh, what happened here? I'm missing one piece. Here. And then there was a war. So I always ask him, Mr. Barghouti, how did this war start? And he said, that's not important. There was a war. I said, no, wars don't happen just like that, out of the thin blue sky. When there is a war, it means that someone attacked and someone had to defend themselves. So who attacked who, Mr. Barghouti? Well, the Arabs were the ones who were attacked because the Jews came to steal their land. I said, no. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about military activity. The Arabs were presented a plan by the United Nations which they rejected, and they attacked with the declared goal of destroying Israel. So to stop misrepresenting the facts. That's what he does. And this is the result. The second big gift from the Arab nations to Israel, attacking Israel and losing. Not that it was an easy war. It was a very costly war. Given the very small population at the time, the proportions are enormous. So the result was Israel ended up with a coherent piece of land, and Jordan kept the West Bank, which it occupied illegally because it ignored the rules, the resolution from the United Nations, and Egypt appropriated the Gaza Strip, also occupying it illegally. So today, this is really important because from 1948 to 1967, which is the next chapter, what is today the disputed territories, were under the control of Jordan. Why did they not create a Palestinian state then? Because nobody thought of it and nobody thought it was important. The Palestinians did not care. It only became an issue when Israel took control of the 67, after the 67 war. So the funny part is that this is another argument. Oh, Jordan was legitimate in seizing the West Bank, and it was recognized by the international community. So I always ask, oh yeah? Who recognized that occupation? And when you corner them, they say, well, okay, 2 countries. I said, oh yeah? Who is that? Who are the 2 countries who recognized the occupation by Jordan of the West Bank? These 2 countries are Great Britain, how surprising, and the other one is Pakistan. Not a single Arab country bothered to recognize that Jordan had a legal right to occupy the West Bank. Again, you have the double standard here. They didn't even care because it was occupied by another Arab nation. And nobody talked about the Palestinians. So that was the result of 48. Incidentally, a very important point here also, you hear all the time about the 1967 border. I have made it almost systematically my duty to interrupt at that point whenever I hear 67 borders. I say, excuse me, what are you talking about? Well, the borders that were between Israel and Jordan, and not Jordan. Jordan is here, and that was finalized by the peace treaty in 1984. But these are the borders, 1967 borders. I said, no, they're not. These are not borders. Do not call them borders. They're ceasefire lines. Borders are the result of a peace treaty. It means that you have sat down, you have signed a treaty, you promise not to make war against your neighbor anymore, and you agree on the delineation of the border. That's a border. This is not a border. And even Obama, when he talked at AIPAC last year, he didn't say the 1967 borders. I checked. He said the 1967 lines. So they were careful not to go there because they would have got a lot of flack for that. So the result of one of the results of the 1948 war is that there were 650,000 Palestinians, Arabs living in British Palestine, who fled because they heard Arab radios telling them, get out of there, our armies are going to come in, we're going to kill anything that's left, and that's going to be all the Jews, and then you can come back and take all their goods. That was basically the essence of the message that they got. So 650,000 out of 800,000 Arabs who lived in Palestine, at the British Palestine at the time, fled. And where did they flee? In 59 camps that were set up by the United Nations that are still in existence today. 59. They're concentrated in the West Bank, Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon. The UN created one single agency to take care of the Palestinian refugees. It's called UNRWA, United Nations United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And for all the other refugees of the world, all of them, there's another UN agency called UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So explain to me the logic here. You have one agency for the whole world, and you have one agency for the Palestinians alone. I don't see an agency for the Tibetans. I don't see an agency for dozens of other groups that would need, that have a lot of refugees, and so forth. So it's problematic because they're still in their camps. You know, they ballooned from 650,000 to close to 4 million today. And how much longer is that going to last? We don't know. But the camps are still there because the Arab countries where they are sheltered do not want to integrate them. They actually are treated very, very poorly in Lebanon and Syria, but particularly in Lebanon. They're barred from coming out of their camps, and they are not allowed to have normal jobs. If you're a Palestinian in Lebanon and you want to become a doctor, you stay in your camp. You're not going to be allowed to practice outside of the camp. It's an apartheid regime, but nobody ever talks
Are
about it.
they able to leave if they want to leave the country?
No.
they
No,
can't. They're stuck.
because they have to find a country of asylum, and nobody wants them.
Does America take in any of
The
them?
America takes a certain number of them, but that's not usually with UNRWA. UNRWA basically feeds them, clothes them, shelters them, and educate them. They're about among the best educated Arabs in the Middle East thanks to UNRWA.
Who funded that?
And we're paying a third of it.
Where are they going now from Syria?
They're fleeing in Jordan primarily and into Lebanon, but primarily Jordan.
And Turkey,
Yeah.
Turkey
And
too.
they're being targeted by other groups in Syria because the same thing happened in Kuwait when the regime supported Arafat. Locals really resented the fact that the Palestinians had a preferred treatment. So there's now hell to pay for some of the Palestinians in Syria.
We heard in Lebanon about Sabra and Shatila. Are these camps that were established back?
That is correct. Sabra and Shatila was one of the camps that was in Beirut, and it was surrounded by a coalition of Christian militias, and they destroyed it. And they committed the crime that everybody talks about and accuses Israel of being guilty of, but the actual killing was done by Christians, militias. That doesn't matter. Nobody talks about that. They all blame Israel because Israel was, at the time, had the IDF controlling Beirut in 85 or 82, I forgot.
So they don't. What's their work? Okay, they're being educated. Okay, they live there. What do they do for sustenance and
70% unemployment.
unemployment?
They're just being fed to do nothing.
So that's the real tragedy.
That is the tragedy, and that is the source of the problem.
Yes.
I've always advocated for years that UNRWA should be disbanded, and the problem of the refugees should be handed over to UNHCR, because UNHCR and UNRWA have two completely different treatment of refugees. UNHCR's job is to relocate refugees, or allow them to come back as soon as the problem is over in their countries, so they can resume their life. UNRWA is not that at all. UNRWA says we will take care of the refugees and their descendants.
So no limit.
So there's no end in sight. It's crazy.
So the
The
numbers,
UN
and the
pays for
numbers
it?
are growing.
And the UN pays for it.
And the numbers are growing.
And the numbers are growing. It is ridiculous. It is one of the most absurd things. So lately, especially this past year, I've been very happy to read more and more articles and more people saying, we have to close UNRWA. We're wasting, I don't know how many, we're giving them millions and millions of dollars. The US is paying for up to a third of this. It's absurd. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit aside. That is part of my second presentation primarily. But here, the one thing that you never hear about in any presentation, and certainly never from the Palestinians, is the fate of the Jews in Arab countries. What happened? What happened is the following. The Arabs were defeated in 1948. They were humiliated. The entire Arab nation was humiliated by the Jews. How could the powerful Ummah, the Brotherhood of Islam, be defeated by a scrappy little army? It was not even a regular army in 1948. People off the boat, out of concentration camps, and they defeated the Arabs. How is that possible? They were humiliated. And you know, if you know the Arabs, you know that humiliation, losing face, is huge. They will kill for it. So, since they could not strike back Israel because they had just been defeated, so what are they going to do? Well, they looked around and they say, oh, wait a minute. We have Jews. We have Jews in our countries. And that was the case. In every Arab country, you had a large community of Jews, that Sepharad, who had been there for centuries. And they were part and parcel of the social fabric of each country, in particular in Iraq, in Morocco. All of these were in Egypt, very important part of those countries. Well, they were kicked out. They were ostracized, there were pogroms, all their goods were expropriated and stolen. And so all of a sudden you have a wave of 800,000 Jews that are kicked out of countries where they had lived forever, for centuries. So where do they go? Israel. That's the only place they could go. A number of them actually went to North America, to Europe. A lot of Egyptian Jews I know went to Europe in particular. Many of them spoke French, so they had some affinity with European countries. But about 600 to 650,000 went to Israel. Now, remember, this is in the 50s. It sort of happened during the 50s. What was the population of Israel at the time? Does everybody know? It was 500,000. So all of a sudden, imagine this. You have another 500,000 people coming into the country that has the infrastructure for only 500,000. So all these people lived under tents like refugees also for a long time, for years, until Israel was able to catch up and build the infrastructure, build houses, build apartments, and so forth. But it happened. They were absorbed. They became part of Israel. They did not become a weight and a dead weight for the international community to take care of forever.
Was there an agency to support them?
I'm sorry?
Was there an agency to support the Jewish refugees?
Jewish agencies, nobody else. No international
The UN?
agencies helped the Jewish refugees that I know of. Jewish agencies helped a lot, but that was it. There were no High Commissioner for Refugees from the UN. They did not help at all for that. There's another factor that is important in respect to that influx of Jews into Israel, is that you had a clash of cultures, because most of Israel, the aliyah, the first 2-3 aliyahs were, is it aliyahs or aliyot? Aliyot. Were made of Ashkenaz from Europe and from Russia, from Poland. And here all of a sudden you have 500,000 people from the Middle East. Two very different cultures, and it was not easy. I mean, there are very interesting books today that tell you how hard it was for the two cultures to mesh and meld into what is today the Israeli culture. So it's quite interesting. So this was another present from the Arab world. Can you imagine? The Israelis went from 500,000 to over 1 million in just 10 years. What a gift. It's like the Soviets coming later, giving another gift from the Soviet Union. Thank you. That was great. You increased the population with this massive arrival. As difficult as it may have been for Israel, Israel managed to integrate them, and now they're all productive citizens. So, oh God. Okay. I'm going to skip the Suez Canal because it's almost already 8. I speak way too fast and way too long. I'm going to go quickly through the main phases and try to get to where we are today. Otherwise, it's going to be too long. So, the Six-Day War, you know what happened. I will point out one thing, however. You hear a lot from the Palestinian side. Israel is the one who attacked in 1967. They're the aggressor. And I've found the answer. Not true. Because what you had was 3 factors that led to the preemptive attack. The Israeli Air Force attacking early in the morning and destroying the Egyptian Air Force. That was the master coup that gave them basically they had won the war. And then they turned around and went to Syria and did the same thing, destroyed all the planes. So they had complete mastery of the skies. But the reason they did it was 3 things. First of all, the Egyptians here had told the UN there were Egyptians peacekeepers, quote unquote, between Israel and Egypt as a result of the 1948 war. They were there to prevent another war from happening, precisely. They were sort of, security, safety zone. Well, Nasser told the UN, get out. Out. We don't want you there anymore. The UN doesn't have the authority to say anything. They said, okay, fine, we're out of there. Well, if you chase the UN from a peacekeeping force zone, you cannot have very positive intentions. The second thing that happened is that the Egyptians started moving armored brigades across the Sinai, getting close to Israel and getting close to the Negev. Not a good sign either. I think it's safe to say that if you're sending your armored brigades, you're not coming over for a friendly picnic. You have pretty nasty intentions. But here is the key argument, the most important one. One thing that Nasser did was to blockade the Strait of Tiran. Strait of Tiran going into Eilat here. That's where Israel was getting most of its oil at the time from Persia, from Iran, which was under the Shah. Or maybe his father even, I don't remember. Anyway, was getting a lot of oil. You need to know that a blockade in international law is an act of war. So he started the hostilities when he blockaded the Strait of Iran. And Israel did nothing but defend itself when it destroyed the Air Force. And I think that's how you turn that argument around. Because to say that Israel attacked like out of the blue because it had nothing better to do one day in 1967, and they just went out because they wanted to practice and they destroyed the Air Force, the Egyptian Air Force. No, there was a very good reason for that. And actually it was not an easy reason, an easy decision to make. The Israeli government agonized over this, and they didn't know whether, they knew they were going to be judged anyway by the whole world and so forth, but they were not really convinced. Nevertheless, they did it, and the Six-Day War, of course, got them the sympathy of the world because it was so extraordinary that it lasted only 6 days against a big attack. So anyway, they ended up with all this. That's the result of the Six-Day War. Golan, the West Bank, Jerusalem, the entire Sinai, and then they made a peace offer. They went to the Arabs and they said, you know what, we're going to give you all this back, or at least most of it that we got in this war, which we didn't want. You started it. But you have to give us something in exchange. And that thing that we want in exchange is peace. So how's that for a deal? We give you back these territories, all of the ones that we just conquered, you give us peace in exchange. What do you think the answer was?
No, la.
La. The Arab League met in Khartoum, and they said, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel. La, la, la. So what was Israel gonna do? What did you want Israel to do? It just stayed in control in all these territories until they, changed their mind. They didn't change their mind. they kept pushing, and they still wanted to destroy Israel. So then we had the Yom Kippur War in 1973. They try again. They're defeated again. But that was a really close call, because Israel this time decided, well, we don't want to be the first one to attack like we did in 1967, because we got judged by the world as the aggressor. So we're not going to do that this time. We're going to wait. And that was a mistake. That was a huge mistake, because they paid a heavy price in lives. And it was a very, very close call. How many of you have been up here in on the Golan, and you can see the plain of tears, and you can see Damascus in the distance? Have you heard the description of the tank battle that took place there? It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. And it was really a very, very close call. The Israelis ended up with 5 tanks out of a sea of Syrian tanks. And somehow they managed to hold them off enough for reinforcement to come. Unbelievable heroes. It's really an epic story.
Didn't they make a movie out of that?
No, I wish they did. I don't know that
Which
there
is
is a
the
movie.
movie
There's
that
a short,
you're thinking
there's a short, how do you call that, documentary about this, yes. But, I mean, this material is really material for a really good, full movie, because it is so extraordinary. And not everybody knows that story. It's really amazing. But it's really important to know, because had the Syrians, they were 2 armored columns, one going on this side of the Kinneret and one going on the other side. Had they broken through, Israel would have lost the war. And that would have been the end of Israel. It was very close. So, in 1979, Sadat decides, okay, enough of this nonsense, let's make peace. He's the first Arab leader who comes to his senses and says, Israel is not going to go, let's make peace. I want the Sinai back. So they make a deal, and Israel accepted to give in 3 slices, one every 2 years or so, or every year. And in exchange for peace, the Egyptians got exactly what the Israeli promised, which is the entire Sinai. Everything was given back, including some settlements in Yamit here, right on the border, that were pulled out, because Israel honored its promise. 1982 Operation Peace for Galilee, I'm not going to go in that because that's an entirely different story also. Long story, the PLO had created its own little kingdom. The PLO was created in 1964, by the way. Then it became a terrorist organization. That's all they did. Their job was to kill Jews. That is to like Hamas and other Palestinian organizations to this day. All they wanted was to kill Jews and Israelis. So they had a lot of operations out of Jordan, and they had basically created a kingdom within a kingdom in Jordan, a state within a state. And it got to the point where the Jordanians it had become a no-go zone for the Jordanians. And the Jordanians started to get really upset. And that's one of the reasons the Palestinians are not liked. Even though they represent more than 50% of the Jordanians, they are not liked by the Jordanians, because Arafat tried to unseat the king, King Hussein, with a coup d'etat. And that is when the Jordanians said, okay, enough now, you're going to get out of here. And they kicked them out. And there were, I don't know how many thousands of Palestinians killed by the Arab Legion, the Jordan Legion. They threw them out of the country. Where did they go? Southern Lebanon. The Lebanese government was not strong enough to prevent them from coming in, so they did the same thing. They created another state within a state, and they started attacking Israel relentlessly, like Gaza. Fire rockets, send in the terrorists, and so forth. Until finally Israel said, okay, basta, we've had it. And they sent Operation Peace for Galilee that kicked the PLO out of Lebanon, sent it into Tunisia, and that was the end of the PLO in Lebanon.
When was the first Black September?
1970.
70.
Yes, and that's that operation. Thank you for reminding me. When the Jordanians kicked out the Palestinians out of Jordan, that was Black September. That's where the name comes from. From 1987 to 1993, we had the first Intifada. The Palestinians in the West Bank decided, well, we don't want to negotiate. We're going to force Israel by having an insurrection. And that insurrection was primarily this. Kids throwing stones against tanks, and the international media all too happy to snap pictures of this and showing how awful the Israelis were, and the poor Palestinians were sending their kids. So it was very unpleasant, of course, but it was not bloody. It was not as awful as the second Intifada that came later. It led the Palestinians nowhere. They got nothing out of it, and so they went back to the negotiating table, which happened after 1990. What happened in 1990? You remember? We went into Kuwait to get Saddam out of there, the coalition. So here you have President George Bush Sr., who had brought a coalition of the willing to kick Saddam out of Kuwait, because that was a blatant aggression, and we did do that. So taking advantage of the momentum of having this whole coalition together, he said, why don't you guys come to Madrid and let's have a conference, and we're going to try to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem at the same time. So they all met in Madrid, and it didn't really yield immediate results, but there were a lot of contacts, and that led to some other things, especially the Oslo Accords. Oslo Accords were the first time where the Israelis accepted to recognize the Palestinians, not just as a terrorist organization, but as a legitimate representative of the Palestinians. That was a big shift, big change. And the Israelis, the majority of the Israeli people really were happy, because they thought, wow, thanks to Oslo, we're going to finally have peace. And everybody was behind it. More than 80% of the Israelis were behind it. And so they signed, and it didn't work. Why? Because the Palestinians never stopped their first two obligations that the Oslo Accords demanded: stop terrorism and stop the culture of hate. To this day, they have not changed. So the Oslo Accords are dead, and if you wonder why, it's not because of the occupation, it's because the Palestinians have not done their part. In 1994, another follow-up of the Madrid conference is that, here we have the second Arab leader who accepts to make peace with Israel, and that was King Hussein. To this day, there's only Egypt and Jordan. And Egypt, we don't know where it's going right now. In 2000, President Clinton is about to leave office, and he said, I've got to do something with this. Like Obama did at the very beginning. Clinton and Bush did at the very end of their term. They said, I forgot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Maybe I should do something before I leave office, so that I'll be recognized as the president who brought peace in the Middle East. So he brought these two guys to Camp David. Said, okay, you two knuckleheads, you do not leave this place until you have found an agreement. He took them to Camp David, and Barak made unbelievable concessions. 93% of the West Bank. You can bring refugees back, not in Israel, but in the West Bank. You can have half of Jerusalem. We'll give you everything you want. What does Arafat do? Walk away. Said he didn't even bother to say no. He just walked away, went back to Ramallah, where he had been allowed since then to move from Tunis because of the Oslo agreements, and unleashed the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was nasty. Over 1,000 Israelis blown to pieces, killed, several other thousand maimed for life. It was really nasty. And what did the Palestinians get out of it? Nothing. Stupid. In 2002, the international community decides, okay, let's try something else. We're going to get the quartet. The quartet is made of the United Nations, the European Union, the US, and Russia. Let's get these four main players of the world community together. They're going to take care of the problem. And they came up with a different plan than the Oslo plan. And it was a good plan because it said the plan was the roadmap, what is called the roadmap. The roadmap was good because it said, well, instead of doing what Oslo did, which was, here is objective A, B, C. If we don't get to objective A, we can jump to C and maybe Z, and we'll figure it out over time. That, of course, never worked. The roadmap was different. The roadmap, they said, well, we can't go to B unless A has been done, and be very progressive like this. But guess what A was? No more terrorists and no more culture of hate. So right off the bat, the roadmap stumbled on, again, the same attitude on the part of the Palestinians. The roadmap is dead today. So in response to the Second Intifada, Israel built a security fence, which I think that's also another thing that Palestinians always omit to mention. And it's always wonderful to ask them, you complain about the wall, which is only 4% of the entire fence, but why was it built in the first place? Oh, because the Israelis want to steal land. So no. It was not there in 2000. There was no fence. Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza were free to travel anywhere they wanted in Israel. They were free to move. Many of them had jobs. Thousands of them had jobs in Israel. So why did the Israelis all of a sudden create this fence? Just because they wanted to be mean to the Palestinians and steal land? No, it's because of the Second Intifada and the terror bombing and the suicide bombers. So come on, let's be serious. Gaza, you know everything about Gaza. I don't need to tell you about that. Israel gambled in 2005 and said, we're going to do something that is really going to show proof to the world that we mean what we say, and we're the good guys. So unilaterally, they decided to pull out of Gaza. We know the result. It was not a good idea. You don't take that kind of unilateral steps unless you have something in exchange. It's fundamental. But they thought they were smarter.
Not for peace is what you're talking about.
What's that?
If you're gonna leave, at least
have peace, have guarantees. Yes, exactly. At least have in place a structure or mechanism that guarantee that you're leaving and you're getting something in exchange. They got nothing. They got worse.
We got rockets.
They got rockets. 2006, Hamas wins the Palestinian elections, and this always makes me laugh because the Palestinians always tell you Hamas was the democratically elected party in the Palestinian elections. I said yes, but what happened a year later? A year later, in 2007, Hamas staged a coup d'etat, killed 350 Palestinians from Fatah, and took over all of Gaza. It's a dictatorship. It's not a democratic system at all. And they haven't had elections since then. Not even Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, the elections, you know when they were supposed to have their last elections? 3 years ago, in 2009. They keep postponing them. I mean, what kind of regime is that? So you have, the Palestinians are divided between this autocracy in Gaza. They're fanatics, they're to this day designated as terrorists, and then you have the Fatah political movement, and they're not even legitimate. Mahmoud Abbas is illegitimate. He hasn't been reelected. He just stayed there. He said, oh, there will be elections later. I'm still in the boss. It's absurd. So, 2006, Hezbollah attacks Israel. You know what happened, the Second Lebanon War. I'll skip that. Then we have, this is really something that a lot of people don't realize when they're not, involved in Israel. I showed them this. I said, do you see this? There are walls and walls and walls of those in Sderot and just across the border. Each one of these rockets contains things that are fly in all directions and are meant to kill civilians. Each one of these is a war crime. Each one of those meets the definition of a war crime, because it cannot distinguish between military and civilian objectives. So finally, the Israelis intervene, and we have Cast-led. I have a whole presentation on that if you're interested, but I don't give it much anymore. It's passé. It's a little bit of history. In 2008, even though the Operation Cast-led was going on, Olmert made a deal that Abbas should never have turned down. It was one fantastic deal, as good as the one that Ehud Barak gave to Arafat. And again, same thing. Abbas just walked away, never came back to the table, and since then has refused to go back to the negotiating table. So in 2009, we're almost there. Obama comes and he says, "Haha, I'm going to be the U.S. president that will make peace, to bring peace to the Middle East." And what does he do? First thing he does is tell Netanyahu that he's got to stop building settlements. And Netanyahu says, well, I can't stop on a permanent basis, but let's stop for 10 months to give us time to have negotiations. And that's fair. What do you think happened? Palestine didn't show up. until the last 2 weeks. And they said, oh, we need an extension. And Netanyahu said, sorry, doesn't work that way. No, you got to be serious. You had 10 months, you had 9 full months, you didn't even show up, you were not interested in conducting the negotiations. We're not going to renew this. And so since then, they have refused to join. Now, their latest joke is to join the United Nations. They can't, because the United Nations does not have the authority to accept a new nation. That's reserved to the Security Council. The Security Council has already said no. The U.S. has at least done the right thing there and cast its veto power. So they may try again this year. It would not be full membership. It's sort of a associate membership. But politically, it would be bad for Israel because it would give them a semi-recognition. And now today we have the very, very dangerous situation that we're facing, which is Iran clamoring about every week or so that they're going to erase Israel as soon as they have the bomb. Netanyahu becoming very, very nervous and a little desperate because he doesn't have many options. Either he does nothing, the Iranians get the bomb, and then what? Or Israel attacks and tries to delay their ability to have a nuclear bomb. And the US doesn't want to be involved. So he's in a very tight spot, and he has the responsibility of millions of lives in his hands. It's a terrible. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. But I think there's going to be something happening fairly soon. We
After
don't-
the elections here,
Maybe before.
maybe before.
Maybe before. So, is 2002 going to be another war or peace at last? I don't know. No say. Questions? I'm sorry I went over time by 20 minutes.
What
You have
Do you
any
think the
questions?
entire Arab world is going to become the Muslim Brotherhood?
They may, yes. The Muslim Brotherhood is the most organized force, political force in the Muslim world. In the short term, it is very probable that they will become the leading force. In the medium to longer term, personally, I am not so convinced because they're a little bit like the Communist Party in Russia. They're ideologues first. It's ideology and religious fanaticism that really dominate everything in the way they see the world. That's not how you feed 18 million people in Egypt alone, another 70 million in Iran, and so forth. And the economy is crashing in Iran because of the sanctions. So I'm not even talking about the other Arab countries. So yeah, they may in the short term, but when people start starving, there's going to be more revolutions. And I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood will last very, very long if they don't find a way to feed their population. That's the bottom line. And also their economies are a shambles. They're a disaster. We're not doing great. The world is not doing great. They're in terrible condition. The entire Egyptian economy, half of it, rested on tourism. Well, since the revolution, that went down. So what do they do now? So they're going to be in trouble before long.
What makes you think that Israel's going to attack Iran?
They have very, very, very limited choice. Very limited. You have only two choices. Either you attack and you hope to drag the US into it, that's a calculus, or to do enough damage to the Iranian infrastructure that it will delay their time to acquire the bomb by a few years. That would be good. That would, I would take it. However, the consequences of how many people are going to be dragged into the conflict on both sides, it could lead to a regional or
counterattack.
Or counterattack, exactly. If Hezbollah unleashes its thousands of rockets, I mean, it could be really, really awful. The other option is do nothing. Take Obama at his word that he will not allow Iran to become a nuclear power, even though he doesn't want to commit to any type of action.
It's a joke.
And hope for the best. But what if Iran just come up with the bomb? And there are now different reports saying they may already have it. And so what are we waiting for now? It's a matter of days or weeks? Are we going to wait until they actually shoot one over Israel?
Well, you know, should Israel be a sitting duck? I think that's
Precisely,
the issue.
precisely. And, you know, put yourself in their shoes. What are you going to do? You know someone is going to attack you. They've been repeating it for the last 2 years. I'm going to kill you. I said, okay, maybe I should take preventive action and knock you off first and make sure that I have that problem taken care of
Do you-
so I can go on with my life.
Do you think United States is like supporting that secretively, like they want Israel to attack, you know?
There's such conflicting moves on the part of the U.S. government. A lot of declarations, a lot of, there have been military moves that are interesting, but some also have been worrisome, like, you know, the cancellation of these huge maneuvers between U.S., large numbers of U.S. and Israeli forces that was canceled or reduced by significantly. Why? Well, at a time like this, it could be that the U.S. didn't want to have 5,000 soldiers kept as hostages in Israel by the Arabs. That's a possibility. Maybe that was their calculus. We don't know at this point.
Couple of things, but what just happened 2 days ago in Libya is putting the United States now directly in the conflict. Maybe
Correct.
it was peripheral before, and it's Israel. Now it's directly against a U.S. ambassador killed in Libya, and this changes the game, I think.
It should. I think it will probably for the American people. American people are, you know, the general response is that, doggone it, we help these people. We sent our planes to fight Gaddafi, to make sure that especially Benghazi remained a free zone, a safe zone, so that the rebels could fight Gaddafi. So that's the way they thank us, but that's the population. The government, that's a different. The U.S. government has a different view, and they've said it already. Well, that was the action of a minority, doesn't represent the Libyan people, and you've seen all the PR photos already. We're sorry, it's not us. Islam is not like that. I mean, whatever. They try to really make it clear that, well, it does not represent the whole Libyan people, which is probably true. But at the same time, I think it leads a lot of Americans to say, you know, the heck with this Middle East. We've had it. We keep losing people. We keep losing people in Afghanistan for nothing, for a regime that is corrupt to the bone. Let's get out of there. So that's probably, it could have an impact. If Israel was attacked, that would be, I think, a different story. Because I believe that the connection between Israel and the American people is still very, very strong. Very strong.
And then the second part is the real two glaring irregularities that need to be taken care of are, one, Hamas you mentioned, yes, it won the election, but it's not the entire population of Gaza. So there is certain elements there that don't want to be under Hamas, and they're under duress, really.
They are.
That they would like to have elections again, and who knows if Hamas would
Yeah,
do
but
that.
Hamas
can't.
illustrates perfectly the joke of what happens when the Muslim Brotherhood takes power. One man, one vote, one time. It never happens again. Once they have power, they keep it. And if anybody comes up and say, hey, what about new election? Here are your elections. We are in power, we keep it. It's not a democratic system at all. It can't. It's a theocracy, and it's a totalitarian regime. It does not tolerate any dissident voices, it doesn't have freedom of the press. I mean, it's like the worst communist regime, only it's a Muslim version.
Well, then it's going to have some time before it is also.
Exactly. Eventually, I think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Eventually, these regimes, the longest Stalinist regime in the world is North Korea. It's amazing that it's still in power. That's because they have a very strong military and they have the bomb. We let them have it. We didn't do anything, so now we have a problem with them. But apart from that, you're right. That kind of oppressive regimes, at one point, something boils over and the population throw them out. And I think it will happen in the Middle East over and over again until they have true democracy. But you know, democracy is that's the big thing that we need to remember. You do not create a democratic state just by saying that it happens overnight. You need to have the basis. You need to have the building blocks of what a democracy is made of. You need to have the separation of powers. You need to have an independent judiciary. You need to have a free press. You need to have people of different parties with different opinions. You need to have free elections. You need to have all these things. Where's the tradition of that in the Arab world? Nowhere. They don't know. They don't know what it means. So they have a long way to come. Now, I don't want to blame them alone, because let's not forget, we were not that much better a few centuries ago. We were also primitive societies. We were also tribal societies, feudal societies. We had slavery not so long ago. So we cannot really, condemn them and point them as barbarians. We were barbarians not very long ago. The problem is that now we are in a world where the advanced societies and the backward societies are sort of in the same level, and they're not. And they cannot be at the same level like this. This is the big problem that the Israelis have with the Palestinians. They're an advanced democratic society. Palestinians are a backward feudal society. So how do you get the two together? You have to bring these guys up, and they don't want to. They don't want to. What they want instead is bring you down, bring the Israelis down.
The last comment that's linked to that is all these refugees. They cannot go on forever that they live in these camps, and they keep growing and growing, and being kept by the United Nations and by the United States.
Yeah, no, that's why I think the solution is to completely eliminate UNRWA. As long as they are being fed, taken care of by the international community, it's like being on the dole forever. You get government checks and you do nothing. You don't have to go to work. You get an education. You get medical care. You get all the benefits of an advanced society, and you do nothing. What's the incentive to become
Something.
decoupled from that? You have to eliminate the agency, and then they're going to have to survive. But you have to have the political will to do that.
JJ, one question is, when they go to the United Nations for a vote, all the Arab countries vote as a bloc.
Yes.
So what is it supposed to be, a 2/3 majority or a half, or what is it?
Right.
The vote of the United
For the vote, absolutely. For the acceptance of a new state by the General Assembly, although it doesn't mean a full recognition. That's impossible legally. But they can get a 2/3 majority that will give a special status to the Palestinians. And it's 2/3. So 2/3 of 193, so that's about 127. I think last time I did my calculation. 127, you take 56 out of that, that's the Arab bloc. Then you have a lot of African countries that are behind the Arabs. You have a lot of third world countries. You are easily over 100. And that's how you have this majority. And this is the same majority that votes against Israel for every resolution.
Is that how they pass all the resolutions?
That's how they
against
pass
Israel?
all the resolutions, exactly. I mean, you have countries like Cuba and dozens of others. They are models of democracy, of course. They always vote with the Arabs against Israel. Okay, I don't want to take any more questions. Otherwise, thank you very much for your patience. Oh my God, 8:30. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
We haven't used.
You had not? Oh, good. Good. That makes me feel better. Thank you. Jean and Franklin, they saw it when I gave it at Tiferet Israel. Yes. Which, by the way, my wife and I, we have joined. Yes. Yeah. We like Rabbi Leonard. We like Rabbi Leonard. He's wonderful. Yeah. Sure.
When you show the picture of Israel, a lot of people see the That's like the arrow pointing to it.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Oh, really?
I don't know if it was your slide. I don't think it was your slide.
I'll double
But-
check on
but, maybe it wasn't your slide, but just in general, like, they see that there's an arrow. You know what I mean?
That's
It
interesting.
just makes it look like it's way